You were chief counsel. You were supposed to keep an eye on all this, weren't you? And you seem to have been oblivious to what was going on in the AAT. Well, either you were oblivious or you knew.
I never saw an advice, no, that it was lawful.
Did you ask for one?
No.
Well, there were lots of things in those talking points that through this process and information from my lawyers provided me from this process, I now understand were inaccurate or untrue.
The contract was worth almost $1 million, Mr. West. Some conversation you now can't recall led to one of the key deliverables on which PwC had worked for months not being delivered. Is that the effect of it?
This is a summary of Week 6 of the Royal Commission into Robodebt. As always, if you haven't seen the previous episodes, I recommend you do that first. I'll link to these in the description. The Royal Commission publishes these hearings on their website, and Week 6 had around 35 hours of footage. I've cut that down to something easier to watch so you can hear the key evidence. So let's get started. This is Week 6. This week we heard from some really high-profile witnesses, including former ministers Alan Tudge and Christian Porter, the top lawyers involved in the scheme, and many others. But first, I've been waiting a while to hear from this witness.
Miss Musolino, would you please tell the Commission your full name?
Annette Musolino.
She was the Chief Legal Counsel at the Department of Human Services between 2015 and 2019. She was effectively the most senior lawyer in the department. We saw her in Parliament over the years defending Robodebt, but it became clear that she didn't analyse the legality of the scheme, instead relying on flimsy internal advice from the Department of Social Services. We've covered these in previous videos, referred to as the 2014 and 2017 advices.
Well, our view was that the evidence was the ATO data. So there was a discrepancy. There was the ATO data. Our understanding was that the ATO data itself was sufficient information to make that, to reach that conclusion or to make that assessment and make that decision.
Did you independently turn your mind to whether or not that assessment had any foundation whatsoever?
I relied on a number of things to reach my view that it was sufficient to make a decision. Primarily, I relied on the advice from the Department of Social Services, who made it crystal clear in 2017, when I first looked at this, that they were of the view that this was a lawful process. When we were compiling material for the response to the Ombudsman's own motion, I was copied in on an email and it attached some other advices. It attached a 2014 advice and a 2017 advice.
Okay, did you look at the 2017 advice?
I think I read it at the time, yes.
Would you see anything in it which actually supported the notion that averaging would suffice for the requirements of the legislation? Any reference to the legislation itself or case law or anything beyond this seems reasonable?
It was a pretty short advice, but I had no reason to second guess what was in it.
As a lawyer, you didn't apply your own critical legal senses to it at all?
Well, my role, so, we're a service delivery agency. When we're given a program to deliver or implement, we don't generally look behind how that decision was made or designed or the legalities. We look to implement it in a lawful fashion.
I'm not sure how you can implement something in a lawful fashion without understanding the legalities of what is being implemented. One thing this witness didn't do is seek independent legal advice. But as it turns out, her team almost did. New information revealed by the Commission showed that in January 2017, someone in this witness's team drafted instructions to be sent to the Australian government solicitor, seeking advice on the legality of Robodebt. But these instructions were never sent.
Have you had an opportunity to review this document before today?
I reviewed it last night.
Okay. Having reviewed it, are you satisfied that it's draft instructions to the Australian government solicitor?
That's what it appears from the heading.
Yes. And if we go to the last page of the document, It says, in the absence of any additional information from the customer, can DHS average by fortnight the income information received from the ATO over a financial year period by either the application of the relevant legislative provisions? And you accept that these draft instructions, had they been finalised, would have asked the Australian Government Solicitor to answer that question?
I accept that if this had been provided to the AGS, yes, it would have answered that question.
Do you have any knowledge of the creation of these draft instructions?
No, I have no knowledge of the first document you took me to, which was the email of 10 January, or the document headed Instructions to Australian Government Solicitor.
In any case, she thought Robodebt was lawful, and her excuse for why she thought this was that she took the word of another department. Apparently though, her confidence in the scheme's legality only grew from there.
But my assurance built with the Ombudsman's report and also my knowledge of what had occurred in AAT decisions where averaging had been affirmed or directed.
The Ombudsman's report was a joke that didn't examine legality. We saw in previous episodes how it was sabotaged by this witness's department. But I find it interesting that she also raises tribunal decisions as a source of comfort. The reality is that the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, or AAT, had in 2017 started handing down decisions that clearly said Robodebt was unlawful. But the department never appealed those decisions, and the justification for this is astounding.
On the heading of the second page, principles to guide the decisions of the departments when determining whether to appeal decisions made under the Social Security and Family Assistance Law. Do you agree with me on that?
Yes, that's a heading.
Thank you. And there's effectively 4 categories of principles set out on that page and the subsequent page. Do you agree with me on that?
Yes.
That as a general proposition, what these principles require is that where there is a significant point of law or stated government policy which needs to be clarified or defended arising from a Tier 1 AAT decision, there should be an appeal.
No.
Why's that?
Because it's pretty clear from these principles that you're weighing up a range of factors. So it's one factor, it's not a decisive factor. So it's paragraph 4 sets out some principles, so does paragraph 1, 2, 3 and 4. They're not in any hierarchical order. It's a question for the decision maker the reviewer who's considering whether they should appeal an AAT1 decision. They need to look at all these factors. And I would not say any one of these factors is decisive or determinative.
In the context of the Robodebt scheme, if the decision under consideration is a decision of the AAT that explicitly states that a fundamental aspect of that scheme is unlawful, then these principles would require the appeal, wouldn't they?
It would depend on how all the other factors weighed in. As I understand the way these were read and implemented, a paramount consideration was whether, a paramount consideration, it's listed under paragraph 1E, is to consider the circumstances of the payment recipient in bringing the appeal. So AAT is the first level of review. The agency would not lightly recommend an appeal to the AAT2 and put a customer through that if they could actually implement the decision of the AAT1. And particularly, so if they could implement it and resolve the matter for the customer, that would be a factor that would weigh quite heavily in that consideration.
Okay, I just need to pause here. This is a document setting out factors to be considered when deciding whether or not to appeal an AAT decision. There are a lot of considerations, and she literally said just before that there is no hierarchy for these factors. But now, all of a sudden, the paramount factor is this random one, which is considering whether to put the Social Security recipient through the headache of an appeal.
More often than not, they're not going to recommend a review because there's no point putting the customer through that.
You'll just put the rest of the customers through it.
But if you can implement the decision of, if you can implement the decision of the AAT and you can resolve the issue for the customer, that'd be a fairly paramount concern. But what's clear is there doesn't seem to be a mechanism, a really formal mechanism of feeding back to DSS. Look, we're not recommending an appeal because of these reasons, but there's this commentary. And I just think that's something that I was reflecting on. That's all I would say.
Okay, but wasn't that your role as Chief Counsel to put systems in place so that you actually did have some kind of overall view of this to see whether you had more than one or two of these decisions and something needed to be addressed?
Yeah, I would take that point, Commissioner. I talked about our maturing our systems.
The averaging aspect of the calculation of this debt is illegal. If you were seriously going to implement that, you would cease and desist from averaging. You did it in the given case, and you regarded that as implementing the decision, did you?
Well, that's how we regard it. Well, as I said, it's a high volume of matters, and the AAT matters were not all going one way. They were kind of a bit all over the shop here. So there were some that were, as I said, approving or actually directing averaging, and some were not. Some were
And some that were not were clearly setting out the reasons.
Yes, but the views of, with respect, with the views of certain members of the AAT or particular members didn't necessarily represent the views of all the AAT members.
This witness constantly brings up the fact that some AAT decisions didn't pick up that Robodebt was unlawful, while others did. The reason for this was that the AAT was politically stacked with incompetent members. These were mainly Liberal Party mates, many of which had no legal qualifications. It's no wonder they didn't pick up on the legal issues. But the department put the decisions of those people in the same bucket as Professor Terry Carney, one of the members who was deciding that Robodebt was unlawful. He was an expert in social security law, but had his role terminated by the coalition government shortly after he started making those unfavourable decisions. I cover this whole issue with the AAT in a lot more detail in this series.
Earlier in our discussion, you referred to there having been conflicting, that is, disagreeing decisions by members of the AAT on the lawfulness of averaging.
Yes.
Where there is that disagreement, isn't that obviously a circumstance where an appeal is necessary to resolve the conflict?
If the appeal is going to be effective to resolve the conflict, that might be something that was considered. But to take us back to the FR's process, it was actually about reviewing the decisions that were in front of you, taking into account all the factors that were in the litigation principles and determining whether an appeal was recommended.
Well, when in heaven's name would that ever be triggered?
How would it be treated, Commissioner?
When would that be triggered?
Triggered.
The consideration that there was a need for clarification on a significant question, point of law or question of government policy. When would it ever be triggered, if not in this circumstances?
Well, clearly it was triggered because there were appeals, there were secretary appeals to the AAT too. So it's not that we never appealed anything, things got appealed. As I said, the process that was being followed, the framework that we had was about looking at the decision in front of you. And that's a consideration, but a really paramount consideration in terms of how this was implemented.
All right, we've heard about the paramount consideration. It's all about the feelings of the recipient. The fact that you had decisions telling you couldn't do this was by the by because you wouldn't want to put the recipient through the trauma of another application.
I think it's just in practice how it happened, Commissioner.
All right, Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Commissioner.
You would think that if the tribunal was handing down decisions saying that a massive government program was unlawful, the department would be quick to appeal. The real reason they didn't isn't because they were concerned about the handful of people who would have to go through a longer appeals process. The real reason is publicity. You see, the Social Services Division of the AAT worked in a way where the initial decision, the Tier 1 AAT matter, wasn't made public. But if there was an appeal to the AAT Tier 2, the decisions would be published. The public would have known that the AAT was ruling that Robodebt was unlawful. The witness is then taken through the details of an AAT decision. Remember, she said earlier that AAT decisions had given her assurance of Robodebt's legality.
Now, Ms Musolino, do you accept from me that this is a decision of AAT member Terry Carney on the 8th of March 2017?
Yes.
Direction 1 is no debt or debt component is able to be founded on extrapolations from Australian Tax Office records.
Yes.
Isn't that a clear direction that averaging is not lawful?
No, I don't accept that. It's a direction that, in the opinion of Professor Carney, in this matter, the matter must be determined with regard to salary records.
So, counsel assisting took her through the detail of the decision before asking her the same question again.
Now, we can keep going through the document, Ms Musolino, but are you prepared to accept that this member was clearly identifying that averaging is not lawful?
He was indicating that the methodology was not sufficient, in his view, to validly make a decision about a debt. He'd characterise it as not legally sufficient to make a decision regarding the amount of a debt.
Indeed, and therefore it would be unlawful to raise a debt on that basis.
Well, it wouldn't be it would be, I don't know if I'd characterise it as unlawful. It's not a valid basis. In his opinion, it's not a valid basis. It's not sufficiently probative to make a valid decision.
And if it's not a valid decision, it's not a lawful decision, is it?
It's not made in accordance with law if it's not made in accordance with administrative law principles, yep.
Okay. In effect, a conclusion of a Tier 1 AAT decision that a fundamental aspect of the Robodebt scheme was unlawful.
Yes.
All right.
So on your view of life, you could go on indefinitely with the AAT finding that you were breaching the law, really, and it wouldn't matter because you would just implement whatever directions were made and on you would go, in complete disregard of this constant indication that there was a problem with the way you were not complying with the Act.
Well,
But it doesn't have to be in every case. If you've got the AAT telling you in a number of cases that that's so, you felt free to ignore it?
Well, there were many other cases where the AAT was accepting or directing that we average. So there wasn't a unified view from all AAT members.
Well, all the more reason to get it sorted out, wasn't it?
Well, there were different views. There were different. As I said, the way we operated in this environment, it's meant to be a quick, efficient process for customers. We've got tight timeframes to respond to matters. The decisions were cutting both ways, so they weren't all going in one direction of the matter.
Ms Musolino, frankly, it seems to me you let this system run, getting decisions from the AAT that told you there was a fundamental problem with its legality on a kind of, oh, well, case by case, it doesn't really matter, we'll confine it to that case's rationale.
We operated within the framework that had been set down for how DHS provided these services to the Department of Social Services.
You were Chief Counsel, you were supposed to keep an eye on all this, weren't you? And you seem to have been oblivious to what was going on in the AAT. Well, either you were oblivious or you knew.
Well, if I can just explain, as Chief Counsel, my role is to actually manage the legal division. It's a huge legal division. I had systems in place for this, for supervision to occur, for monitoring to occur. Each and every one of those decisions was looked at by a lawyer, reviewed, and a recommendation was made. I couldn't do the work of every lawyer in the division, but I was confident that there were systems in place for those decisions.
What was the system for identifying a recurring theme?
Well, that's what we talked about yesterday. I think that was one of the deficiencies, and I accept that.
But the fact is that the AAT was finding that averaging was not a legitimate procedure in cases, not all of them, but in some. And that proved to be perfectly correct, as the Solicitor General's opinion demonstrated. So that went on through 2017, 2018 to sometime in 2019 when around about March 2017 somebody could have been having a look at this. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, by March 2019, that's right. We were.
No, not March 2019. March 2017 you were getting decisions from the AAT pointing to a problem.
But absolutely, and as you said, Commissioner, they were cutting both ways. So
Doesn't matter if they were cutting both ways. The problem was being pointed to. It could have been dealt with in March 2017. It wasn't until the end of 2019.
I accept that.
Okay.
Not only did this witness fail to put a proper system in place, she personally knew about Terry Carney's decision in 2017.
So therefore you became aware that the tribunal had reasoned that it was not lawfully possible to calculate debts using averaging in the way that it was being used in the Robodebt scheme, correct?
Well, I was aware of the decision and aware of how the member had reasoned in that decision, yes.
And yet the program continued for years. This witness will need to return to give evidence again, and I'll cover that in a later video.
I do.
Thank you. Take a seat. Yes, Mr. Greer.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Can you tell the Commission your full name, please?
Rachelle Jane Miller.
Rachelle Miller was the former media advisor to Alan Tudge, a former minister we will hear from shortly. It wasn't long ago that we found out that Alan Tudge and Rachelle Miller were demonstrating strong coalition family values by having an affair while both married. In fact, this witness received a $650,000 settlement from the Commonwealth for bullying and harassment while working for Alan Tudge and another coalition minister, Michaelie Cash. In any case, she reached out to the Commission to give evidence. She started by explaining Alan Tudge's ambitions.
I recall we had a discussion about that ambition of his to promote himself in the media and use relationships with more senior cabinet ministers who were already there to advocate for him joining them in cabinet. So, and I said, well, you know, a good way to do that is to be seen to be having wins in the media for the government. So, you know, scoring good stories in the main newspapers about the achievements of the government and the reform agendas of the government, and particularly stories in what you'd call the left-wing media. The right-wing media. So you're talking about Murdoch Press or the Australian Daily Telegraph, Herald Sun, because that was, you know, kind of where the votes were.
In terms of the content leading to publication, do you know where Ms Martin got her content from?
Yes, from me.
Okay. You obviously knew Ms Martin?
Yes. So I gave her the media release as so she could run it as an exclusive. So she got what we call a drop or an exclusive from us to run the story, and then we issued the media release as soon as the story went live. And then other media might have picked up on the story throughout the day. I think the Minister might have done a few radio interviews. I can't recall. But that was a common practice. Rather than just sending out a media release and hoping that a journalist might just pick it up, you then take away the exclusive. If it's an exclusive, it's more likely to end up on the front page.
I see. And I take it Ms Martin was one of those journalists with whom you sought to cultivate relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
To increase the Minister's profile.
Yes, yes.
At the end of 2016, Robodebt started getting a lot of negative attention in the media.
To your recollection, did the OCI, or Online Compliance Intervention Scheme, as it was then described, receive adverse media publicity in late 2016?
Yes.
And do you recall what the sense about that was, or what the response was in the Minister's office?
Well, whenever there's a proliferation of negative media stories about a particular minister's portfolio area, there's always deep concern, and the priority is to shut that down. So yes, there was concern about the stories were coming up. However, I did note that it was predominantly in the left-wing media. I mean, it was entirely in the left-wing media at that stage. And, we weren't too concerned because it wasn't unusual that the left-wing media were attacking us regarding social policy.
Where does the ABC fit in all this?
I would have said that they were in the left-wing media camp.
Okay, just checking.
And how would you go about shutting it down?
I developed a crisis media strategy at the request of the minister. I would have done it anyway, but that's what we did. He was very firm with me that I needed to shut this story down. But that media strategy was quite comprehensive that I developed in January to shut down the story, and that involved, placing stories with the, the more friendly media, the right-wing media, about how the coalition was actually catching people who were cheating the welfare system. And that media, including the likes of A Current Affair or others, has a lot more reach. The commercial television programs, the 2GB radio, that type of thing, has a lot more reach. So actually the message that was getting to people on the ground was that the coalition is cracking down on welfare cheats, whereas in the kind of left-wing Canberra circles, it appeared to be quite a crisis. But we were getting feedback from the Prime Minister's office that actually this was playing quite well in marginal seats, Western Sydney, that type of thing.
Which was playing quite well.
Well, the narrative of that Robodebt was actually playing quite well in terms of people actually supported it and were supportive of the notion of the government cracking down on anybody who was cheating the welfare system.
Another media article that was run in The Australian on, I think, 26 January, Australia Day.
Yes.
You seem to have some recognition of the article.
Yes.
What can you say about it?
That was an article that we liked.
Again, this was what you described as part of the media strategy in an effort to engage with a journalist who were prepared to present an alternative view.
Yes.
Where you worked with them and provided them with the information which would enable the story
Yes. Yes.
to be written in a way that the minister liked.
Yes.
Or at least presented in a way that the minister liked.
Yes. And Simon Benson was very good at doing that.
The Australian really is a garbage publication. Interestingly, Simon Benson, the journalist who was so liked by the Minister's office, was a few years ago revealed to be in a relationship with Coalition Senator Bridget McKenzie. She's best known for the sports rot scandal. Anyway, another part of the strategy was to deter victims from speaking to the media. This was done by going after Social Security recipients who had publicly complained and releasing their personal information.
What do you recall of the topic of releasing personal information from persons with whom Centrelink dealt to the media?
So we didn't think of doing that at all, ever, because when I first joined, because we understood that the personal details of any Centrelink recipients was confidential and that we weren't able to release any information. It was a little bit frustrating, actually, because you'd read a media story, you go to the department and say, well, what's going on with this person? Once you've got the full story, you kind of like, well, the media article's quite misleading, but we've got no way to, correct the record. Well, we've got no way to defend ourselves, so we basically just said nothing. So I requested Bevan to just go and find out. And he came back to me verbally and just said, oh, well, it looks like there is a way we can release specific details just to correct the record, just to correct the public record. And I said, oh, well, okay, if I was going to do this, in this case I would, point out X, Y, Z. Is that able to be cleared by the Chief Legal Officer, Annette Musolino, for us to do that? And it came back, yes, you can. So the legal advice to us was that we were able to do that, but just the specific pieces of information, you couldn't just, hand out their whole file to the media. It was just specific lines that contradicted what had been said in the original piece. The minister requested the file of every single person who appeared in the media.
Did you notice any impact of the decision to release personal information into the media upon the nature of media stories from that point?
Yes.
And what was the impact you observed?
Well, there were less people speaking out in the media, which was the intention.
One of the biggest examples of someone's personal information being released was that of Andy Fox. She had written a piece for Fairfax outlining her experience with Centrelink. In response, the government authorised the release of her personal information to another journalist to write a counter-article. The matter was referred to the Australian Federal Police, who refused to investigate. And it was also referred to the Privacy and Information Commissioner, who found the release of information was fine. More on this later in the video. Rachelle Miller's evidence was eye-opening. After she appeared at the Commission, she got a lot of backlash online for her role in Robodebt. She justified this by saying that she needed her job, and said, "We do what we have to." That sure seems to have been the attitude of most people involved in this disaster. We will now hear from former Coalition Minister Alan Tudge.
Can you tell the Commission your full name, please, Mr Tudge?
Alan Edward Tudge.
Mr Tudge, as you say at paragraph 3 of your statement, you were the Human Services Minister from 18 February 2016 until 20 December 2017. That's correct?
Yes.
And during that period of time, as Minister for the Department of Human Services, you oversaw the administration of various policies in a service delivery sense by the department.
The question meaning, is that correct? Yes.
Yes. And one of those came to be known as the Robodebt scheme, which attracted significant media and political attention during your period as Minister.
The OCI became, the online compliance intervention became to be coined by the Labor Party as the Robodebt scheme, yes.
Well, that's not a great start.
When you describe your focus in January 2017 on making sure that the program was better and more user-friendly, was the legality of it or the fairness of it. Did you at all focus on those questions in January 2017?
Two different questions there. One about the legality, one about the fairness. The legality questions, no, I didn't. The fairness question, absolutely.
Right. Did you ever see an advice from your department which confirmed in your mind that the scheme, the OCI scheme as it was described then, was lawful?
I never saw an advice, no, that it was lawful.
Did you ask for one?
No.
One of Alan Tudge's contributions was when he appeared on A Current Affair to talk about the ramp-up of Robodebt.
We will find you, we will track you down, and you will have to repay those debts, and you may end up in prison.
As I understand it, you're saying that the quote, "we'll find you, we'll track you down, and you'll have to repay those debts," which was presented in the Current Affair program, related to fraud matters.
It was a direct question on fraud, a direct question, which was not covered in the program, which was asked of me directly. The question was, and I recall the question, what would you say to people who deliberately defraud the Commonwealth? And I gave my response in relation to that question.
Would you agree with me that the language related to fraud and the language related to compliance, that is, administrative overpayments which don't involve any concept of dishonesty and relate to mistakes or errors in an administrative process of reporting
Yep.
became conflated and easily conflated.
That was not my intent. Going back to the current affair did not make that distinction, and it annoyed me greatly because they led with that quote, and then the whole story was in relation to inadvertent overpayments, and so conflated the two.
It would have been relatively easy for you to issue a media statement, though, correcting the distinction, if it was particularly important to you.
It wasn't my practice, probably still isn't my practice. You're doing a lot of media, and if someone says something that it's incorrect, even on a current affair, you don't necessarily issue a media statement in relation to it.
In all of the government's messaging, they conflated fraud with compliance. Fraud was only a tiny proportion of cases, and yet mixing the issues meant that people were more scared of the government's actions and more willing to do what they were told.
You would appreciate that the conflation of the concepts in the media at that time could give rise to the impression for recipients of letters that they might fall into the fraud category.
I think that people would honestly know whether or not they had committed fraud, right? If they...
But Mr Tudge,
they
isn't
get,
that saying...
If an individual gets a letter which says there's a discrepancy between what they had self-reported some years ago with what the Australian Taxation Office says, I mean, I think they're going to know themselves whether or not they had deliberately underreported. They will
Do they know that they're not being accused of fraud?
I mean...
There are two different things here.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't see inside the minds of every recipient who received a letter.
In the table at the top, the line in respect of the source of debt relates to fraud is 0.1% as a proportion of the total percentage of debt raised during that year.
Yes. So what?
So my point is you had actual knowledge of the very small proportion of debt cases, and it was an easy thing to say once you appreciated, as you did by that date, that fraud and administrative error were conflated. To build that into your language at every subsequent media interview you did.
A little while back, Alan Tudge said he was focused on the fairness of the scheme. Let's see that in action.
But you were being asked whether you're aware there were inaccurate debt notices being issued.
Yes.
Were you or weren't you?
I was aware, well, I was aware that the system, even from an income averaging perspective, had the potential to create inaccuracies.
I want to skip now to his evidence on the release of Social Security recipients' personal information to the media to counter the narrative.
Did you direct through your DLO the department to collate details of everyone who appeared in the media complaining about inaccurate or unfair processes related to the OCR scheme?
No.
Do you say they did that off their own bat?
I always wanted to know where there was substantial cases in the media that appeared that on the surface appeared that someone was very harshly done by. I wanted to understand that. And more than understand that, I in fact instructed my team and the department that if there was concerns and that they were legitimate concerns, that a member of the department was to call that person, talk it through and talk through what their rights and responsibilities were and how they could address any particular concern.
There was an occasion when a person who had appeared in the media and criticised Centrelink during this period
Yes.
was met with a response which plainly identified who that person was,
Yes.
details of their personal information.
And that case had nothing to do with the OCI or the PAYG manual compliance system or the system before that.
But it did have a lot to do with the media strategy whereby rebuttal through the media confronting what was said to be inaccuracies about adverse media criticism would be met. Why did you consider it was appropriate to have that person's details released in the media?
The situation in that regard, and I assume this was still within the scope of the Royal Commission despite it being outside of the programs defined as Robodebt.
Well, we're talking about possibly, on some evidence we've heard, a strategy to intimidate people who might have complained about Robodebt.
Right, okay. Well, I disagree with that, Commissioner. This was a case where it was not just a story, but a 1,200-word piece, which was the prominent opinion piece in each of the Age, Sydney Morning Herald and Canberra Times. So a big opinion piece, most opinion pieces are 800 words, and the feature opinion piece in each of those newspapers. My concern was that would give a false impression to the community at large, and so having sought advice.
Do you mean legal advice?
Yes.
Right.
So I sought advice from the department, which was in the form of legal advice, as to whether or not the record could be corrected on here. It was done to correct the record of that one particular instance, which was by far and away the most prominent case that had been released, not by anybody else other than herself in terms of writing a 1,200-word opinion piece.
It made very clear that if somebody wanted to criticise Centrelink in public, they were taking a risk.
That was certainly not my intent, Commissioner, in doing this. My consideration at the time, Mr Gregory, was that leaving this article to stand, being so prominent in the Fairfax papers, could actually have the reverse effect that would make some people concerned about the operation of Centrelink.
And we all know there was nothing to be concerned about with Centrelink. But there was a lot of things to unpack there. Apparently, it was really important for him to correct the record in the media and release people's personal information to do that. Yet, in his earlier evidence, he said the current affair interview that apparently took him out of context didn't warrant any correction. It was also interesting that he asked for legal advice on whether he could release personal information, but never requested legal advice at any stage on whether Robodebt itself was legal. Let's now go to his excuse on why he didn't stop the program, even though he knew the harm it was causing.
You didn't think it necessary to raise any question of whether, for the reasons Mr Gregory's identified, the accuracy issue, the putting the onus on people who may not be well equipped to deal with the system, and the going back years, it might be better to reconsider whether this program should continue.
And at the time, Commissioner, operating within my authority to implement the Cabinet decision. So the Cabinet decision, which I didn't have the authority to overturn, had made those decisions to review certain years, to place greater burden on the recipients to find the data, and also that income averaging would be used as a last resort when people did not respond. They were the Cabinet decisions, which I didn't have the authority to overturn.
But you were the minister on the ground and you could see what was going on. Were you not able to report back to your colleagues that there were these problems arising and that this scheme was harming people?
So, both my immediate report, Christian Porter, as well as the Prime Minister, were aware of the issues associated with what came to be defined as Robodebt. And I had, for example, several briefings with Prime Minister Turnbull, conversations, briefings, formal letters sent to him. His office was well aware, and there was no indication to overturn the decisions of the Cabinet in 2015.
Mr Gregory?
The letter that you and Mr Porter co-signed to the Prime Minister is behind tab 259, Exhibit 3671. The letter indicates it's an update to the Prime Minister about the progress of OCI. You start by identifying the source of the measure and its value to the budget. And then you go to address the significant investment in countering misinformation about OCI. Do you see that?
Yes.
Nowhere in the letter do you identify that there were valid criticisms of the scheme in respect of the potential for inaccuracies built in as a result of averaging.
No, but it was pretty well understood, even by virtue of the reference to the refinements made to the OCI, that there were substantial changes made to it to improve the system.
All right, and look, can I just get clear your evidence about that? Did you ever actually say to Mr Porter or the Prime Minister, who would have been Mr Turnbull, that consideration should be given to stopping this program?
No.
Just days after he gave this evidence at the Royal Commission, Alan Tudge announced that he would resign from Parliament.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'd like to inform the House that I'll be resigning from Parliament effective from next week. My passion has always been in social policy rather than economic or security policy, the traditional Liberal focal areas. I've always believed that while the economy is the foundation of our society, the social policies determine whether individuals are given the opportunity and responsibility to realise their potential. That's why I've been passionate about working with colleagues in this House to lead policy reforms over the years, such as strengthening the sustainability of our social security systems.
A common criticism of the Royal Commission is that there won't be any consequences. While we have to wait and see what the findings are and what referrals the Commission makes to other agencies, there is power in the public hearings themselves. No other scandal had managed to take down Alan Tudge, but one appearance at the Royal Commission and he resigned.
Yes, Mr Gregory.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr Jongen, you're employed with the Department of Human Services or Services Australia?
Services Australia.
And you have been employed with Services Australia or its predecessors of varying titles, I think, since the 4th of April 1973.
That's correct.
You are often described as the spokesperson for the department.
That's correct.
You had a significant role to play in respect of the compliance and debt recovery scheme, which has been described as the Robodebt scheme.
That's correct.
Dealing with negative media was a central part of your role.
Yes.
And dealing with it meant neutralising the criticism for the reputation of the department.
That's part of my role, yes.
Responding to the content of it where you can.
Yep.
And emphasising positive aspects which might not have been emphasised in negative media articles.
Yes.
As the spokesperson for Centrelink, this witness came up with quotes that the media then used. From his evidence, he basically relied on what the department was telling him, and it wasn't his job to question it. He spoke about what happened when one time he did try and question it with the Deputy Secretary whose division was in charge of Robodebt, Melissa Golightly.
I bumped into Melissa Golightly in a corridor, and I took the opportunity because I thought it would be useful in a friendly way to engage her in the discussion. And I outlined to her a number of concerns that I had. I told her that I thought the letter was bad. I asked whether it had been focus tested. By that I mean tested with groups of customers to see whether they understood it. I was concerned that it didn't have a call to action in the form of a phone number, which I thought was decidedly unhelpful. In addition to that, I'd also asked to be shown how the system worked. because I felt it was, this is not uncommon for me, I felt I needed to understand what the customer experience was. And once I went into the system, I found it was incredibly difficult to find the button that enabled you to start to resolve the problem. So I raised these concerns with Ms. Golightly, and it ended up a very heated and aggressive discussion where she told me, firstly, that the program had been pilot tested. Secondly, that this was business as usual. And thirdly, that basically it was none of my business.
Thanks, Mr Hannan. Take a seat. Mr Gregory.
Thank you, Commissioner. Can you tell the Commission your full name, please?
Bevan Hannan.
And your occupation?
I'm a public servant. I'm a Acting General Manager of the Communications Division at Services Australia.
Because you were served with a notice after the first two public hearings, I take it you had the opportunity to watch some of the evidence that was given in those public hearings.
Yeah, I'd suggest I binge watch those.
How did it make you feel?
The first 2 weeks?
Yes.
Quite upset.
Why is that?
Because from the evidence in those first two hearing blocks, it became apparent that people knew that aspects of the Robodebt scheme were unlawful. As a public servant, I'm livid that there was an opportunity in January of 2017 to say there was a problem and it wasn't said. And yeah, it's a disgrace.
The fact that Robodebt was unlawful should of course be a massive focus. But even if it had been lawful, as in the legislation allowed the program to run the way it had, it wouldn't have been fair. And this scheme was obviously grossly unfair and defective.
Is it fair to say that you were the immediate liaison in the department with Ms. Rachelle Miller, the media advisor for the minister?
While she was in that role, yes, for large parts of that.
And that would be daily or multiple times a day, according to the circumstances of the media demand?
That's right. The process was established by the then Secretary, Catherine Campbell.
And it involved a clearance at a secretary level for a number of aspects of the media process?
Ms Campbell's clear expectation was that any cleared media content had to be approved by the responsible Deputy Secretary. So nothing that our team prepared went to a minister's office without getting that level of approval.
You say that you were assured of content by the business area, and in the case of Robodebt, who was that?
There was a number of people involved in those early stages. I mean, ultimately, it was the Deputy Secretary, Melissa Golightly, who signed off on everything. But in those early days, there were a number of executive level staff who we would have consulted with and signed things off with. National manager level would have been Scott Britton. There was an acting national manager, Gary Clark. At the general manager level, Karen Harfield and Marcus Markovic, and another one, Craig Storen, and he was acting in those early stages for a period when Melissa was away at the deputy level. So they were the regular people we consulted with at that executive level before Melissa would sign off on it.
Let's move on to another former Coalition Minister, Christian Porter.
Yes, Mr Gregory.
Thank you. Commissioner, can you tell the Commission your full name, please, Mr Porter?
Charles Christian Porter.
Mr Porter, you took on the role of the Department of Social Services Minister from 21 September 2015.
That's right.
And you continued in that role through to December 2017.
Yes.
Thereafter appointed to the Office of Attorney General.
Yes.
Until March 2021.
Yes.
When Robodebt started really getting criticised in January 2017, Alan Tudge was on leave and Christian Porter was covering for him.
The date 3 January, you may recall, was a day you participated in a Radio National interview, I think, from Perth in the morning.
Yes, that's right.
Here are extracts from that interview.
Well, Christian Porter is the Minister for Social Services. So, I mean, from what we've seen, in a high-volume system, it's actually working incredibly well. Now, there will, from time to time, no doubt, be people who, for whatever reason, are experiencing difficulties getting online or having problems, but we're incredibly accommodating of those circumstances. Now, what this system is doing is actually raising real debts around real overpayments based on real cross-referencing of evidence.
Can you not see, though, why some people might find the whole thing quite terrifying?
Well, what you're saying to me, Hamish, is if people over-respond or if people find it inconvenient, that the response to that by a government should be to not do it. Now, if we don't do it, that is $4 billion worth of taxpayers' money that got wrongfully paid, that can never be recouped, and in incredibly difficult budget circumstances where we're trying to return the nation to surplus, we would have to try and find other ways to save that money. I mean, I think that this is about as reasonable a process as you could possibly devise.
Well, there were lots of things in those talking points that through this process and information from my lawyers provided me from this process, I now understand were inaccurate or untrue.
In his evidence, Christian Porter claimed that he had been told that Robodebt was legal, and so he didn't really question the legality while he was Minister or Attorney General. The problem is that his memory on this was pretty sketchy.
As you describe it in paragraph 38, the topic arose almost incidentally.
Yes.
But the representation made to you, as I understand it, was that there was, as you say, a sound legislative underpinning for the scheme as it was operating.
Yes, but I do distinctly recall putting a question in the structure of, I presume whilst we're dealing with all these things, that everyone's assured about the underpinnings or legal underpinnings. I don't know the exact language that I use, but I'm trying to describe it as the best way I can there, and I can't recall who it was who affirmed that assurance, but someone did, and I recall that it was a departmental person. I couldn't say if it was DSS or DHS, and it happened quickly, and we moved on because it just wasn't the focus of what was going on.
You don't seem to have approached any of this from a lawyer's point of view, really, do you? You don't seem to have at any stage said, well, by what authority do we send the letters, or by what authority do we average, or by what authority do we impose a penalty?
Well, I'm obviously legally trained and I'm a lawyer, and I bring that to working in a portfolio, but the environment's completely different, and pausing at every point to question the basis of every action or omission that was being administratively undertaken is just not a process that you went generally through. And I appreciate that in these circumstances there was controversy around it, but there were many controversial programs. I can say, Commissioner, had some of the correspondence that I've now seen or some of the doubts that existed in the department been raised with me, in all likelihood that extra step would have been taken. But
because you see, Mr. Porter, everybody says it was really somebody else's doing, and it's a bit hard to get to the bottom of whose doing it was. And any light you can shed would be helpful.
Well, there are certain critical points and gatekeeping points around this, and there's no doubt that period in January where I was heavily involved was one of those. I don't dispute that at all. The creation of the policy is probably the most important point in that respect. But the failure to penetrate through that fundamental question that the Solicitor General addressed, and it occurred most critically at different points in time where that question was most likely to be asked and addressed. But had information that I've seen come through the Commission been available in 2017, then I think that authoritative advice from outside would have been sought 2 years earlier than it was.
You take any responsibility for this?
I do, and I look back on this and I see myself through the correspondence getting quite close at points to taking the next step of inquiry, and I didn't do that. I wish now that I had, but I also see the reasons why I didn't do that.
Christian Porter defended Robodebt through the years, constantly refusing to apologise. He ended up resigning from Parliament in 2021 after an anonymous donation scandal. If you want to know more about that, I've done a video that you can check out afterwards.
The response is I do. I do.
Thank you. Ms Richards, can you tell the Commission your full name, please?
My name's Janean Richards.
Ms Richards, in 2017, what was your role?
In 2017, I was the Group Manager for Corporate in the Department of Social Services.
Does that mean that you were the top of the legal tree within DSS in that role?
It meant that I was the most senior lawyer in the hierarchy of the department.
Thank you. Much better way to put it. Was your counterpart in the Department of Human Services Annette Musolino?
To the extent that my position was responsible for legal services, yes.
Earlier in the video, we were talking about the government releasing the personal information of Social Security recipients to the media. The government was relying on legal advice from some time ago, in 2004, to say that the process they had followed was legal. But when the matter was referred to the Information and Privacy Commissioner, that commissioner went and sought his own legal advice to figure out whether what had happened was lawful. And the advice he got conflicted with what he was being told by the department. This witness sent a letter to the Information Commission disagreeing with their interpretation, and in my view, forced them to abandon their advice and not cause any issues. This seemed to work because the Information Commission ended up saying that nothing wrong had happened, despite their own advice saying the contrary. It seems to be a habit of government departments to ignore legal advice they don't like.
The issue that arose for us, Commissioner, was that advice had been obtained jointly by the Department of Human Services and the Department of Social Services, I think in about 2004 or 2005. I'm a fairly eminent lawyer in the Australian Government solicitor on the scope of the protected information provisions. And so the Department of Human Services and Social Services had operationalised that advice. So for some time, both departments had operated on the consistent basis that the law should be interpreted in a particular way.
Right, and then?
And then the Information Commissioner commissioned an opinion from Hennessy SC, who was not familiar or wasn't made aware in that case of the pre-existing advice.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
And so our concern was very much having an inconsistent opinion produced, having potentially quite significant operational implications for the administration of the Social Security law. Because Mr Hennessy's opinion was that the provisions needed to be interpreted in a way that was more confined than the advice that had previously been provided by the AGS.
But doesn't that highlight the need to then take the next step? That the resolution is not that you convince the Privacy Commissioner to not go there, it is that you say the way this should have been done is, as you just indicated, with a single voice, a single set of questions, because now you have conflicting advices. And the resolution is not to ignore the latter one, but is to take the next step and engage with the process in that context and obtain a new advice according to what you say was the spirit of the legal services directions.
Well, I don't think that we thought it was necessary to seek further legal advice to clarify the potentially conflicting legal advice, because we actually thought that the opinion that had been provided in 2004, 2005 from a very eminent lawyer within AGS was the correct one.
Was Mr Hennessy SC not sufficiently eminent for the department's position?
Well, I had no beef personally with Mr Hennessy SC. I don't think we did, but we just weren't comfortable, weren't satisfied that his view was correct.
But yes, what I'm suggesting is you might come to a different view and you might firmly hold that view and you might be convinced you are correct. But the fact that there is an existing advice already obtained by another entity within the Commonwealth surely highlights the fact that the resolution is not just to repress the inconsistent advice, however much you believe it to be wrong, but to take the next step, because taking only the first step gives the appearance that both departments are working together to impose a position upon the Information Commissioner which requires him to withdraw a process he's engaged in and submit to an earlier advice because the department's assert it is the correct one.
To the extent that if they felt that it was necessary to pursue this interpretation, as we proposed and as indicated in my statement, we were prepared to have that the two opinions put in front of Senior Counsel in a process that was administered by the Attorney-General's Department for that conflict to be resolved. In the end, the Information Commissioner actually revoked the decision and that became unnecessary.
The next witness was from PwC, who were contracted by DHS to independently review Robodebt in the early days. PwC, a Big Four accounting firm, has been in the media recently after it emerged that they had helped the government come up with tax laws for multinational companies, only to then turn around and leak confidential information about these laws to its customers. There's more and more coming out about this, and I might cover it in a future video.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr West, can you tell the Commission your full name, please?
Shane Michael West.
And your occupation?
I'm a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers.
Questions on the notice that was received by you and your supplementary statements and the documents produced in addition to those statements deal with the engagement of PwC by the Department of Human Services in early 2017 in respect of what became known as the Robodebt scheme. That's correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Before we get into the detail of the engagement and the work undertaken by PwC, can you just give us a broad overview of how the engagement came about?
So it's my recollection that Catherine Campbell made contact with one of our other partners, a fellow partner, to indicate that they might need some support in undertaking an independent review, and then that was forwarded to me.
Main liaison, point of liaison between PwC and department, did that continue to be Ms Campbell or Mr McNamara?
Mr McNamara.
We heard Jason McNamara give evidence in my Week 3 video.
Didn't that tell you that there was a fundamental problem with the program?
Told me there's a fundamental problem with the Australian education system where people can't understand averaging.
Now I need to go through a bit of background because this witness didn't seem to be able to recall much and was being extremely evasive. PwC was engaged to provide a detailed report identifying issues with Robodebt. Their fees were almost $1 million for this work. But despite almost finalising the detailed report, which was 97 pages long, it was never provided to the department. In the evidence, they referred to this as the draft report. Instead, the only thing that was provided was a visual presentation, basically a few PowerPoint slides. This witness tried to say that the department never wanted the draft report and was happy with just the visual presentation. Not only that, but he said the department didn't even know the draft report existed.
Well, there must have been some discussion at some point about the fact that PwC had developed a draft report.
So I think my recollection was our working understanding going through the engagement was that we would be providing a report of that nature.
Yes.
So that's why we commenced the drafting of it. But prior to the completion of even the drafting of it, it became clear that the previously provided presentation would constitute the report for the purpose of the work order. So we saw no purpose in finalising the thicker report.
Well, you said it became clear that the presentation would constitute the report. How did it become clear? Who said that?
I can't recall exactly who said it, but...
This is an email from Mr Bowe. He was a senior manager in PwC working on the project.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's an email to Mr Webber and to yourself, which attaches a draft which appears to bear the date 30 May 2017. That is the date of the email.
Yes.
And it refers to a discussion a couple of weeks ago with DHS that the draft report would be provided around the 2nd of June, and DHS intended that it be marked protected/sensitive cabinet. Does that prompt your memory of the timing up to which the drafts were developed?
Yeah, I mean, that tells me that we were still working on the draft at the end of May.
At the end of May, and that there was an anticipation from a couple of weeks earlier that document would be provided within a couple of days of this email. That is by 2 June.
Yes, the day document would be provided around the 2nd of June.
Well, the document is the draft report.
So I don't recall ever having a conversation with the department about the provision of the attachment to that email.
You may not, but Mr. Bowe clearly indicates there was one. That's what this email records, isn't it, Mr. West?
So that email records that there would be the provision of a DHS implementation strategy document.
Yes. Which is the document which is attached to this email. You can see that from the second paragraph.
Which turned out to be the presentation that we spoke about previously.
Well, that might not be right, Mr. West. What this email makes clear, I suggest, is that the document which is attached to it is the DHS Integrity Modernisation Implementation Strategy, which is described in short form in the first sentence as the DHS Implementation Strategy document. And in the second paragraph, it confirms that what is attached is the latest version of what is described in short form as the DHS Implementation Strategy document, which is in fact the draft report as it's described fully in the title. That's clearly what it communicates.
Yes.
And what was attached was a draft report as at 30 May 2017.
Yes, so what was attached was still clearly at that point in time our understanding of what we would subsequently be providing to the department.
And by subsequently you mean later that week?
Yeah, at some point post that date, yes.
Well, 2 June, around the 2nd of June.
Yeah.
Right. And by this point in time, PwC had already given a presentation to Minister Tudge, correct?
Yes.
Right. And that's the visual presentation that you said earlier PwC was informed would be sufficient to satisfy the requirement of the deliverable of the report.
Yes.
Okay. So even after the presentation had been made to the Minister, there was a discussion, it seems, mid-May approximately, referred to in the first sentence, which confirmed the common understanding at that point between DHS and PwC that the report was what PwC always understood the report to be and that it was still required.
So I'm not sure I completely agree. So a few weeks, like it could have been earlier, but as I say, my recollection is DHS had no knowledge of the report that we had, of the thicker report that we had developed or had been developing.
Yes. They knew PwC was working on a draft report.
I'm not sure that they did.
Had they managed to agree that the report would be provided around the 2nd of June, do you suppose?
So my recollection is that were expecting something to be provided in a report format. I just think that the difference is that the thing that you're categorising as a presentation became the report. So I don't recall the department ever having knowledge that we had a more detailed report that we had been drafting.
Is that because you weren't having the conversation which is referred to in the first paragraph? It was Mr. Bowe who had that conversation.
I don't know what the substance of that conversation was, but I can't ever recall us having a conversation with anyone at DHS about the existence of that draft thicker report.
He keeps saying the draft report was the thicker report, as if to suggest that what they did provide to DHS, the visual presentation, was somehow comparable. To be clear, there was only one report, and that's the one that wasn't provided to the department. By this stage, it was basically complete, with no further work needed. All that was left was to have someone independent within the organisation have a read to make sure it made sense. After that, it was good to go.
What's clear is that no more work on the content by the team is contemplated by this stage, and no more substantive analysis by the team is contemplated by this stage.
I think that's right, but
okay.
I can't say that with certainty.
Your review of the report, were you satisfied that subject to that independent review, it was complete in terms of the terms of the contract?
I can't recall, to be honest.
What was made clear to you? Gosh, we're happy with the presentation you did, no need for anything more, or... I mean, I'm trying to understand the context in which that would actually come up. On your version, DHS has no clue you're even preparing this thing. Is that right?
Well, I can't recall ever having a conversation with them about us preparing this.
And yet somehow it's made clear to you that you don't have to produce it.
Well, I'd categorise it as it was made clear to us that what we'd already produced constituted the deliverable.
And how does that come up even if... How do you get to a point just at the time you've almost got it finalised where it's then clear that a presentation you've given a couple of weeks earlier will fit the bill?
Yeah, I don't recall the conversation. I'm sorry.
Surely you must, as the lead on the project, have gone back to Catherine Campbell and said, you've paid for the report, we've done the work, why don't you want it?
No, we didn't.
Why not?
Because we didn't. There was still work to be done to finalise the report.
Not a lot. Was there?
No, probably not a lot, but still some.
The contract was worth almost $1 million, Mr. West. Some conversation you now can't recall led to one of the key deliverables on which PwC had worked for months not being delivered. Is that the effect of it?
It wasn't. The department didn't consider it a deliverable because they didn't know of its existence.
Well, how can you say that when you haven't documented any of this?
We also weren't able to find any indication that they were aware of it.
One possible view is that there's been some sort of a nod and a wink and a don't give us a thanks somewhere along the line, Mr. West. You can see how a cynic might wonder about that.
I can, and I cannot recall ever being provided such a nod and a wink or a...
But whatever it was not much better because it's nothing documented anyway. Whatever the form the nod and the wink took.
Other than, I don't, as I say, I don't recall ever anyone having a conversation with anyone in the department about the existence of the report, so they weren't able to say don't provide something.
That is really remarkable that you work on it for months and nobody in your team mentions it to anybody in the department. Do you agree?
I don't know what they assumed was happening through that period. Our assumption clearly for the majority of the engagement was that there would be a report of
Look,
that
I have to
nature.
tell you, this really challenges credulity. That nobody in DHS, well, on your understanding of things, gets wind of the existence of the report, and that PwC just abandons the report at this stage of preparation without any documentation of how that happens. But whatever you want to say about it, here's your chance.
That's my recollection, and that's what we've been able to uncover or not uncover through the searches that we've done.
You might be wondering, what's the big deal here? Why would this report not be finalised? And why wouldn't the department just want it for their own information?
Would you agree with me that although neutral language is used throughout the draft report, it really was a damning indictment on DHS system of debt recovery?
I'm not sure I'd categorise it as a damning indictment. And
how would you categorise it?
Room for improvement. Significant improvement.
It was woeful, wasn't it? That was the PwC assessment.
So I think our view was that there were things that should have been considered that weren't.
Well, that's plainly clear from the report, but it's written in as neutral language as possible, you would agree?
Yes.
Yes. And the volume of that work that PwC did over the next 4 years, which you detail in your statement, reflected invoices of somewhere between $12 and $13 million.
Yeah, I've never tallied it up, so...
Does it sound right to you?
Sounds right. Yes.
It is a lucrative source of work for PwC, its engagement with DHS.
Oh, I'm not sure I'd categorise it as lucrative.
All right. Not insignificant?
Not insignificant.
That evidence was a train wreck. The next witness replaced Serena Wilson at DSS when she retired. We heard from her in week 2.
Mr. Williamson, would you please tell the Commission your full name?
Nathan Carson Williamson.
About the middle of June 2018, you became Deputy Secretary for Social Security at the Department of Social Services until February 2020?
Yes.
Thank you. And is this right? In that role, during 2018, you reported to the Secretary, Catherine Campbell?
Yes.
We now go back to 2018, where DSS went to the law firm Clayton Utz for advice on Robodebt's legality. The advice came back saying it was unlawful, but the department never finalised the advice and just disregarded it. In the last video, we heard from Alison Essex, who reported to this witness. She said she had flagged that advice.
You say there, sometime after I commenced in DSS in mid-June 2018, I had a very brief conversation with someone in DSS who I cannot now recall. I believe it was in the margins of a meeting on another issue, or possibly in passing in a corridor. I was told something like, DSS is getting legal advice on the online compliance program. I cannot recall whether they were telling me that DSS was in the process of seeking advice or had received draft advice. See that?
Yes.
Okay. So this conversation you're describing here in paragraph 24, do you recall who you had that conversation with?
Not with certainty.
Okay. When you say not with certainty, are you saying that you have no idea, or that you can put it more concretely than that?
No, not that I had no idea. There were a few SES who worked in this particular division, but it was likely to be Ms. Essex,
right.
But I didn't name her in my statement because I couldn't be certain.
Okay. Do you recall at one of your regularly scheduled meetings with Ms. Essex discussing the Clayton Utz advice?
No.
And just for completeness, do you recall at one of those meetings, in reference to the discussion of that advice, you noting that there was an established view that the program was legal based on the Ombudsman's consideration of the Robodebt scheme?
No.
Do you ever recall stating to Ms Essex at one of your regular meetings that there was an established view that the program was legal based on the Ombudsman's consideration of the Robodebt scheme?
No.
This was the evidence of Miss Essex, that at this catch-up on the 26th of August, you were talking about that letter from the Ombudsman, and in discussing it, she told you about the Clayton Utes advice and said that it said averaging was not legal, and your response was, it is legal, it's clear that it's legal. If we have a robust advice, let's evaluate the situation, but it's legal. That's her account.
So my only recollection of anything that could be related to the Clayton Utes advice is, as per my statement, that particular conversation. I don't recall having a conversation where Ms Essex raised the advice. From my perspective, that sort of response does not sound like the sort of response that I would give in a normal discussion with someone. That's not my style. So,
well, what actually happened was this advice just bubbled along for another year. So it's quite important to me to be able to sort out what to believe here about what happened. Is there anything else you can advance that would assist me in reaching a view on who did say what to whom?
no, my statement is my best recollection of anything that could be related to it, and I would have expected that if Miss Essex had raised the advice with me, she would have provided me with a copy.
It's hard to know what the truth is here. What happened to that Clayton Utes advice remains a mystery.
Mr. Stipnieks, could you please state your full name?
Maris Andres Stipnieks.
Now, from August 2016 to February 2019, you performed the role of General Counsel, Program Advice and Privacy within the Legal Services Division of the Department of Human Services.
Correct.
This witness was mentioned in previous episodes, and he reported into Annette Musolino. At some point while he was on leave in January 2017, his team put together instructions to the Australian Government Solicitor to clarify the lawfulness of Robodebt. We heard about this for the first time when Annette Musolino was giving evidence. These instructions were never sent off.
You can see that it's an email from Mr. Barnett to Mr. Gladman, CCing Mr. Daly, dated the 10th of January 2017. And the attachments are indicated to be AGS instruction.
Yes.
Do you accept that this is the attachment to the email we just looked at?
I have no reason to think it's not.
Okay. And all of the people involved in that email were people within your team at the time?
Yes, they were.
Did you have knowledge that at that time instructions to the Australian Government Solicitor were being developed for advice regarding the lawfulness of the Robodebt scheme?
No, Counsel, I didn't. I was on leave, according to my records, from about mid-December through to I returned to the office on the 19th of January. I don't recall seeing this document. I mean, it doesn't appear to have been sent to me, and I could find no record of it, and I genuinely have no recollection that that was a document that was referred to me by Mark when I did return.
Okay.
In the last episode, we also heard about the Administrative Law Conference that took place in 2017. The keynote speaker, Barrister Peter Hanks, had ripped into Robodebt. This witness was at that conference and was the one updating his superiors in real time on what was being said.
You know who Mr. Hanks is?
Certainly do.
You agree with me that he is an eminent public law barrister?
I do.
A barrister that's not infrequently briefed by the Commonwealth itself?
I'm sure that is the case.
In fact, has appeared in the High Court in public law matters?
As many eminent silks have.
These are a series of emails from yourself to Ms Musolino.
Yes.
And the effect of them essentially was you, literally as it was happening, informing her of what was being said by Mr Hanks during his lecture at the conference.
Yes.
Okay. Do you agree with me that Mr Hanks clearly identified an issue as to whether or not it was lawful to raise debts using income averaging on the basis that doing so is not consistent with the terms of the Social Security law?
That's what I said in my email, yes.
Right. You knew of substantial media criticism of the scheme in January 2017?
Yep.
You knew it was a high-profile program?
Yep.
You knew it had significant implications for the government's budget?
Yep.
You knew that if what Mr Hanks was saying was true, that the Commonwealth was taking from Social Security recipients money that the Commonwealth was not entitled to on a massive scale.
Look, I don't say, I wouldn't say I had an idea of the scale, but that sounds reasonable, yes.
And if indeed, in those circumstances, it turned out to be unlawful, the Department and the Commonwealth generally would suffer substantial reputational risk.
Yes.
And in circumstances where, so far as you were aware, the only legal advice that had been obtained about the practice of income averaging constituted the 2014 advice, which said it was unlawful, and the 2017 advice, which on one interpretation didn't support its use in the program. Correct?
The Commonwealth's basis for proceeding was the 2017 advice.
Yes, which on one view didn't support its use, the use of income averaging in the program.
Yes, that is correct.
And there had been no, so far as you knew, external legal advices on the lawfulness of the practice?
None that I knew of.
Okay. So in those circumstances, on any view, wasn't the only appropriate course to recommend to the Secretary that independent legal advice be obtained, given the nature of the risk that the Commonwealth then faced?
I don't necessarily agree with that, but it wouldn't be my call. I mean, at that point in time, I am confident that Ms Musolino would have been engaged in frank conversations with the most senior people in the department about a way to proceed.
This witness said that he thought his boss would be having those discussions. The following year, in 2018, Professor Terry Carney, the former AAT member, released an article outlining how Robodebt was unlawful.
You recognise this document, Mr Stipnieks?
Yes.
This is Mr Carney's article, The New Digital Future for Welfare Debts Without Legal Proofs or Moral Authority.
Yes.
We can go through it in detail, but do you agree that the main thrust of the paper was that averaging was being used unlawfully in the Robodebt scheme?
I think, yes, that was one of the major matters raised. He raised quite a number of issues, but yes, that was a key issue.
This article caused the Ombudsman to come back and ask more questions of the department. This witness, despite being aware that these issues had been raised for some time, was then involved in drafting a document that attempted to rebut Terry Carney's article so that the Ombudsman would get off their backs.
But you understood the arguments identified in this document were to be relied upon by the department in its meeting with the representatives of the Op.
That's right. They were the responses in rebuttal to the arguments in the Carney article.
With a view to providing assurances to the Ombudsman in the face of Mr Carney's article. Correct?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. You see, it says DHS disagrees with Professor Carney's analysis, which is both confused and misconceived.
Yes.
Do you now regret use of the word misconceived?
is probably intemperate language.
Do you think it overstated the strength of the department's position?
Yes, probably did.
Did this document, at any stage in it, acknowledge your level of confidence or lack thereof that the use of averaging, as it was being applied in the Robodebt scheme, was or was not lawful?
No, it didn't reflect my particular personal views. It was reflective of the portfolio position.
The portfolio position, that is the position of the Commonwealth?
Yes.
Right. Did you understand that your obligation as a lawyer of the Commonwealth, when putting legal arguments for the Commonwealth, to include ensuring that those arguments are fairly put?
Yes.
And not overstated?
Yes, and I would do so if I was providing legal advice to a client.
But what about when you're putting an argument that's to be used in a representation to the Ombudsman?
The context is different.
Why?
Mr. Scott.
Why?
Because when you're giving legal advice, you are being asked a very specific question, and you are providing an answer which to your client, which outlines risks, which then gives your client an opportunity to consider those risks and take appropriate action. In this particular case, the document was developed in the context of responding to public criticism that was then used with a view to providing comments to the Ombudsman about the Commonwealth position.
This is how unlawful schemes continue. These senior public servants, knowing personally that the scheme was wrong, continued to justify it. And that's the evidence for week 6. The final report is due to be released on the 7th of July, and I've got a few more weeks of evidence to cover in the meantime. Thank you for watching. These videos take a lot of work to put together, and if you feel like helping the channel grow, then please consider checking out my Patreon page. I'll put a link in the description.